It needs to complete
Mike, I need to see what I written in preparation.
You can do it.
Right, well, but now you have, many of you have met Dr. Karber, who has kindly agreed to come and talk to our community about his experience in Ukraine and about his understanding where Ukrainian armed forces are now and the state of Ukrainian defense and future requirements. And I would like to make a small introduction because Dr. Karber has a very long and illustrious career in a variety of fields. And I will try to squeeze in 2 minutes his achievements that you understand his background. He is a former U.S. Marine, a distinguished scholar and internationally recognized expert in strategic issues of geopolitics in relation to national security matters and defense. Dr. Karber is a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, PhD in International Law from Georgetown University, and holds certificates from Howard's JFK School of Government, the Wharton Business School, and the Howard Business School. Since 1978, he has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, teaching courses on national security and military affairs, where he also was founding director of the university's Asian Arms Corps Control Project and their Machiavelli seminar held annually in Florence. I must say, when I read Machiavelli seminar, I had a little chuckle Dr. Karber. So yeah, that's a very aptly named. Dr. Karber has prepared studies and recommendations on defense strategy for the highest levels of the U.S. government, advised major NATO governments on defense issues, served as an external advisor to the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörth. Dr. Karber is also an accomplished business executive. He headed Braddock, Dunn and McDonald Corporation's International Division, served as JFK International Air Terminals Chairman of the Board, to name just a few. Dr. Philip Karber is also the president of the Potomac Foundation, an independent, non-profit research organization dedicated to improving the quality of public dialogue and national policy formulation. His military writings have appeared in 2,000 books and articles published in well-known and reputable journals. His areas of expertise are strategic assessment and planning, future warfare, concept development, defense planning, long-term military competition, nuclear proliferation and extended deterrence, and political-military relations. At the request of the Ukrainian government, over the last 32 months, Dr. Karber has made 25 trips to Ukraine assessing the ongoing war and spending 177 days with troops at the front. His reports from the battlefield have been delivered personally to NATO, to the Pentagon, State Development, and US Congress, as well as many European ministries of defense. At the present request of the Ukrainian Chief of the General Staff in June 2016, Dr. Karber briefed their top 300 commanders on lessons learned from hybrid war in Ukraine. He is a strong proponent of increased military assistance to Ukraine. There is much more that could be said about his accomplishments, but it is time to welcome Dr. Karber, who so kindly offered to share his insights about the current state of Ukrainian defense and future requirements. This is a very complex subject, and we have only limited time. So on behalf of the Ukrainian community of Queensland, I welcome Dr. Karber and invite you to join me in this welcome. And before Dr. Karber starts his presentation, we found out that he is very happy to take questions. Would you like to have them asked after your presentation? Yes. So, and I would ask you, whoever would like to ask the question, could you please state your name, that we now know that, and then we proceed from there. So thank you again. No, that's half of the truth only.
Дякую. Let me start by saying a word of thanks to the
Australian military. They're the ones who brought me here. And when friends in the Ukrainian diaspora and the United States had recommended that I try to reach out and give. I just had recently given a similar talk in New York to their Congress on the 25th anniversary of 24th anniversary of Ukraine, and they encouraged me to reach out here. So it's really because of the Australian military that I was able to come. And by the way, they bent over backwards to adjust the schedule and make it possible to do several of these, both here in Brisbane and also in Melbourne and Sydney. Are we going to click for me? I have 5 major points I'm going to try and make today. Ukraine has been in and out of the news. Frankly, I think it doesn't get the attention it deserved for much of the last 34 months of combat now. But the violence continues. The Russian threat to Ukraine and also to other countries in Eastern Europe continues to grow. But, and I don't think this is appreciated, Ukraine's military today is stronger than it's ever been. There's an entire new generation of commanders who came of age at the front. I know most of them personally. I've been with a number of them in combat. And they are as good as any commanders I have served with or been with around the world, and I've been around with a lot. My last point is I think also not appreciated. The narrative, at least in Europe, tends to be, oh, Ukraine needs our support. And I think what's lost is that Ukraine has as much to offer the West in terms of Western security as the West has to offer Ukraine. I thought, because people I found with the American Ukrainian community, they see press reports, but they don't really have a good sense of how the war has evolved. And particularly some of the major battles, and also some of the successes and defeats that have been inflicted on Ukraine. So I thought, if you'll humor me, I would walk you through sort of how the war has developed, show you some examples of the major battles, and also introduce you to some of the leaders that I've come to respect, and then we'll, at the end, talk about the future. Potomac Foundation was founded in 1988. I helped found it, and then I went off and did other things. It was founded by owners of my former company who took some of their profits when they sold the company and created a nonprofit organization that does nonpartisan work, but focuses on security. And part of what makes us different than a normal think tank is we go where the action is. So when things were heating up in Southeast Asia a few years ago, we actually went through the South China Sea, actually did it with the Philippine Navy SEALs and a number of other places. So we like to go. We believe that having direct observation is powerful and important, and that's something that we do that's different than most think tanks that just write about stuff. Potomac had ran over 1,000 training sessions at the end of the Cold War for the former Warsaw Pact members of Eastern Europe and also Soviet republics who wanted to reform their military or think about joining NATO. In fact, we actually had an office at NATO headquarters. Several Ukrainians had attended those training sessions. So when Russians invaded Crimea and Yanukovych fled, the interim government sent a message to us and said, we would like to bring over some of our new civilian leaders and some of our generals, and would ask you to organize a training session for them. So we said, sure. We had a 3-week training course led by with a number of American generals and security experts. In fact, this is Andrei Parubi, who was a commandante at Maidan. Then trouble started in the Donbass, and so they sent a message and said, gee, we appreciate organizing it, but we can't take our top dozen guys and bring them and take them out of action for 3 weeks. Would you be willing to come over here and help us assess the situation? I'm generally, at least I thought I was, a Republican, and I wanted to do it as a bipartisan effort, so I reached out to an old friend, General Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Often he and I had talked about the current partisanship in Washington. If that had existed during the Cold War, we probably wouldn't have won the Cold War. So I called him and I said, hey, Ukrainians have asked us to come. I'd like to do it as a bipartisan effort. As you may know, he was a 2004 Democratic presidential candidate in the United States. And I said, there's nothing in it. I mean, there's no money. It's just on our nickel. But I think it'd be interesting. Without so much as a hem and a haw, 36 hours later, we were in Kyiv. We were there for about a week, and Clark says, this thing is going to get worse. I'm headed to see the president of Romania, the president of France, General Breedlove at NATO, and try and get into see Obama, which he did. So we got to find out what's going on in the front. What was happening in that period was the U.S. Embassy and most NATO embassies stopped their military and intelligence people from going east of the Dnieper because they didn't want to get them assassinated or kidnapped. So they did not have any hands-on people at the front. So it was very hard to understand in late March 2014 what was really going on. So I went to the embassy and said, hey, I have some of your attachés, go with me. No way. I went to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. They said, oh, we don't want to get an American in danger. So I put together my own team and started going to the front to assess things. I thought that was going to be a one-time issue, little did I know. So now, 34 months later, I put over 12,000 kilometers on some of the worst roads of any country that claims to be developed. As those of you who know Ukraine, you know that very well. And 25 visits. We spent about 177 days here at the front throughout the course of the combat. So when the Ukrainians were mobilizing, I was there with them when they launched their summer offensive, which I'll tell you about. I was there. The winter offensive, which was really brutal, enormously brutal. I got to see firsthand. This is Yuri Bereza, commander of the Volunteer Dnipro Regiment. He personally is responsible for preventing Dnipropetrovsk from falling to the separatists. The day that he got a warning because the pressure had been put on the police to stay home because of threats, kidnappings, and so forth. And what they'll do is they'll call up a guy and say, we know where your wife and children are. Don't go to the protest today. So the protest is marching through the street of Dnipropetrovsk, led by a Russian agent and Spetsnaz guys, and then some locals. And he knew they were coming, so he brought a shotgun that day. He and one other guy showed up for work. And when the Russian agent came to the front door of the administration building, he met him there, and then from underneath his coat he pulled out a shotgun and put it below the guy's chin and said, you may take the building and me, but I'm taking you with me. And then they decided to disperse and they left. And that is literally how the city of Dnipropetrovsk was saved. Sometimes I'll carry a weapon. I just don't want to be taken alive. I've been behind the lines a couple of times, usually twice by accident, only one intention. As I said, the winter offensive was really brutal. During it and afterwards, I went systematically across the front and interviewed every frontline brigade commander. And then often they would send me up to their forward battalion or command post and be there with the guys, sleep in the mud, in the same brutal day in, day out, to get a sense of what was going on. But I also got a great sense of Ukraine's new leadership. Summer 15, I was with Special Forces east of Mariupol and managed to get, we were being chased by or followed by an unmanned aerial vehicle, quadcopter, about a half hour, and then a higher altitude unmanned aerial vehicle came over, and 10 minutes later we got an artillery strike, so I managed to bring some shrapnel home from courtesy Russians. And spent a lot of time with their Ukrainian Special Forces. Clark and I came back in the summer of 14 and had a closed session with the full U.S. House of Representatives, or the one half the U.S. Congress, the Armed Services Committee, behind closed doors for 3 hours, arguing that Ukraine needed assistance. We argued for 5 areas of help. Eventually, the administration, after almost 2 years of struggle, ended up doing 4 of them. They still, which were all non-lethal, and the 5th, the lethal one, they still have not provided. Because I've been at the front, both the Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, give me some awards. Minister of Defense gave me an authorization paper so I could get through the various border guards here. This last trip, the last couple last trips, I spent an increasing amount of time with the General Staff. This is General Muzhenko, the Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. I spent now about 40 hours with him, interviewing him on various aspects of the war. I found him to be a very straight, very honest guy. I brought General Greenlove, the NATO commander, to the front. This is General Zabrowski. You'll hear me talk about him. He's a hero of Ukraine. He's the best of the best in terms of their new leaders. General Soto, at the time, he's now head of all the airborne forces. At the time, he was the commander of their famous 95th Brigade. Soto was commander of their 25th Brigade. This is General Soto and I on their increasing armament. So let's talk a little bit about what was Russia up to. People use the word hybrid warfare.
No, that's all right.
Oh, just slide that over. Sorry. So the Russians clearly have been developing this sort of new doctrine, new concept for how to wage international war. We in the West have a term which we call hybrid warfare. Some people call it gray area warfare. And the Russians have part of that in their concept. But let me emphasize that their approach is much more comprehensive. So, speak up, Mike. So, hybrid warfare is this lower end of conflict, and generally with the major state actor at least hiding there. The Russians like to hide theirs very well. But unlike our concept, and the Russians will use the word hybrid warfare, but they use it to describe us, not their concept. Their concept they generally call new generation war. So, but it also involves the threat of direct intervention and implementation, threatening nuclear weapons, as well as providing good services to be the arms control arbiter. So if you just take Ukraine, Russians invade Crimea. Then they take the number 3 and number 4 men, who with their agents to get the Crimean parliament to invite Russia to be part of, or to have Crimea introduced into Ukraine. Brought those guys to the Donbass along with special forces, and they started the subversion. They then converted that into people's democracies. And when I say people's democratic republics, if that sounds like North Korea, that's exactly what it is. It is a Stalinist regime based on coercion and threat. When the Ukrainians tried to counter that, the Russians then directly invaded Ukraine. All the time, they've also threatened Ukraine with nuclear weapons. By the way, they threatened NATO with nuclear weapons during this process. Ukraine, at the end of the Cold War, inherited several thousand Russian nuclear weapons. Under the Budapest Agreement of 1995, Ukraine gave those up, sent them back to Russia, with a promise, a security commitment from Russia that would guarantee their sovereignty and their security and their territorial integrity. They also got a similar guarantee from the United States and from Britain. Well, obviously, so they gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for them. So obviously, Russia violated. So the Ukrainians then come to the British and the Americans and go, you negotiated this thing, you gave us your guarantee. And our lawyers said, well, we promised we wouldn't invade you. We didn't promise we would keep the Russians from invading. And the Ukrainians said, thank you very much. We weren't really worried about Britain and the United States invading us. Well, that was not why we thought you were signing this. I'll tell you what, would you do me a favor, you can go a lot faster. Okay, this is sort of a look at the conflict. It's measured, so to make it as an event on this slide, it has to have violence of at least an infantry company or a artillery battery, so a decent exchange of fire. So the Russians took Crimea, relatively bloodless. Then they started taking over the Donbass. After waiting and waiting, getting Poroshenko elected, the Ukrainians, and trying to have a ceasefire, the Ukrainians finally launched what they called Plan B. Plan A was negotiated, didn't work, so Plan B. They were within about 2 weeks of succeeding, and the Russians then invaded. Several very bloody battles, and Ukraine was saved almost miraculously. And I'll describe it too. Most people don't appreciate how close it came to being lost in that battle. Then they had the Minsk I ceasefire, and almost immediately it was violated. These were attacks first on Mariupol and then on Donetsk airport. The Ukrainians defended Donetsk airport, slaughtered a Russian airborne regiment from the 76th Guards Airborne Division at the airport. So both our Secretary Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Gabriel met and had a recommitment to their peace, to the ceasefire vows. That lasted through the Christmas season. Russians stood down their forces and then launched a major winter offensive. 6 major attacks. Ukrainians felt if they lost more than 2 of them, the war, they would lose the war. They lost 2 in some horrific battles, but held the others. And both sides were exhausted after that, so then along came this N2 peace ceasefire, which, as you can see, isn't a ceasefire. As each side got resupplied, in the summer of 2015, the Russians planned and executed or began the execution of a summer offensive. This time the Ukrainians saw it coming, decisively defeated it. And you have Russian commentators in Moscow, military commentators, saying that because of that defeat, the Russians called off the rest of the invasion. If there's any doubt about Russian fingerprints on this conflict, you'll notice all of a sudden it drops. This correlates to the day when Russian ambassadors went around to Bulgaria and Turkey and other NATO countries asking for overflight rights for their air force to get to Syria. And for 2 months, the Russians were pushing the U.S. and Europeans, join us in a Syrian campaign. We all against ISIS, which basically meant supporting the corrupt Assad regime. When the West did not agree to it, boom, violence came back. The violence at the end of August of this year, which was, by the way, happening at the same time as the Russians did one of the largest exercises that looked like it could be another invasion of Ukraine, was the 3rd highest level of violence. And it's dropped down a little bit since, but still. So the fighting and dying continues. Next slide. So, we had the myth of the little green men. It is absolutely amazing. A year and a half after the Russians invaded Crimea, you would still find in major Western newspapers or news bureaus like Reuters or Associated Press say the alleged Russian. And you go, really? Next slide. There was no alleged about it. Next slide. So the Ukrainians, special forces under General Lukashenko, who was then not head of all the armed forces, set up teams here and here to defend these 2 passes. This is the pass coming out of Sevastopol, the pass coming across the river. The interim government was told by both Bonn and Washington, don't resist. We'll put pressure on the Russians and put heavy pressure, and we'll take care of it. So the Ukrainians didn't fight. They may not have won, but even so, but nonetheless, they did not fight. And just with the occupation of Crimea, they lost a lot of their forces. The Marine unit, which was ultimately repatriated back to Ukraine, tried to defend their base. Their ammunition had been taken away from them. Yanukovych had refused to issue the ammunition. So they defended their base with their fists, and The reason 50% of the troops were lost is they were beat with lead pipes and baseball bats by the Russians to the point that the soldiers could not return to duty to broken backs and axes. I'm going to talk about.
You mentioned Yanukovych
Yeah.
at the time.
I'm sorry.
I thought it was Poroshenko.
2014.
No, Yanukovych, the former president, was president at
At the time of the invasion of Crimea.
or was just in the process of fleeing. You had Maidan. Yanukovych orders the army to move against the demonstrators. General Zamana, chief of the Ukrainian army, refuses. Yanukovych fires him. And then I was interviewing Zamana and General Clark and I were interviewing, and Clark asked Zamana, he said, how many of your officers supported you? Batting an eye, Zamana said, all of them. So nobody in the army would support Yanukovych. And therefore, and he then ordered the special police forces, which had been fighting at Maidan. They brought in their snipers, and in a 30-hour period killed 110 of the kids at Maidan, mostly with headshots, or the first responder medical person who had been down to kneel with them. The population just went nuts. And without the army to back him up, Yanukovych then fled. And then the Russians came off the distance. I'm going to talk a lot about Mikhail Zabrovsky. I first met him when he was guarding the approach to Ukraine. He is one of dozens of the new breed of young Ukrainian officers. He was in the Russian army as a junior officer, switched over to the Ukrainian army, led some of the most decisive battles. In fact, the two famous ones, one of which saved Ukraine, received a Hero of Ukraine, and is now head of the airborne forces. I'll talk more about it. Next slide. So, one of the first places I visited in March of 2014 was the Ukrainian forces holding the isthmus here at Crimea. The Ukrainian army had been neglected for 20 years. Not because the army was neglected, but because the parliament and the presidents didn't send money. The Ukrainian army had inherited thousands of Russian Cold War equipment, but it sat and was unattended. At the beginning of the conflict, there visited air bases that had 100 airplanes. These are multi-million-dollar, sitting wingtip to wingtip, hadn't been flown in 10 years. Tires flat, hoses rotted, batteries dead. So there were only a couple of units that were able to respond initially in the crisis, because the other guys had been so neglected. They couldn't even drive their trucks out of their facility. So it was the 95th Brigade that was sent down here, and that was Zabrovsky's unit. Then later they participated in these battles. Next slide. So I'm visiting him in this position, and General Sodel's, then Brigadier Colonel Sodel's holding that position. So I visited him, and this defense line right here, this is the road and railroad coming in. And we're walking around, this was his defense positions. Thin trenches, few mines. I said, do you have any anti-tank mines? No, we don't have any. So what do you have for, I can look through the field glasses and could see right here across a couple battalions of Russian mechanized infantry, tanks, heavy artillery. And so I turned to him and I go,